To understand medieval people, you have to start here. You have to start with their deep, unshakable belief in God and the devil. This wasn't a casual Sunday thing. It was everything. It was the air they breathed, the frame for their entire reality. And it was terrifying. Their God wasn't just a figure of love and mercy, he was a judge. He was wrathful. He watched everything you did, every thought you had. A bad harvest wasn't just bad luck, it was God's punishment for the village's sins. A sick child wasn't just a tragedy, it was a test of faith, or a sign of divine anger. The world was a stage for a cosmic drama, and they were the actors. One wrong move, one moment of weakness, could bring judgment down not just on you, but on your whole family or community. They saw his hand in everything. A lightning strike, a flood, a plague. These were direct messages. And you lived in constant fear of displeasing this all-powerful being who held your life and your eternal soul in his hands. But if God was a distant, judging father, the devil was an immediate personal threat. He was real. He was active in the world. Satan wasn't an abstract concept of evil. He was a creature who commanded armies of demons, and their sole job was to tempt you, to trick you, to drag your soul to hell. They believed demons could hide in the shadows of a room. They could whisper sinful thoughts into your ear while you tried to pray. They could possess your body, sour your milk, or cause your horse to go lame. Every single person, from the poorest farmer to the richest king, was engaged in a personal daily war against these forces. A moment of pride was a demon's victory. A flash of lust was the devil finding a crack in your armor. This wasn't metaphor. They believed it literally. Life was a spiritual minefield. The world was filled with temptations laid like traps by Satan himself. A pretty face, a warm tavern, a chance to steal a loaf of bread when you were starving. Each choice had eternal consequences. This created a constant humming background anxiety. Am I strong enough? Did I just sin? Was that thought my own? Or was it a demon's whisper? And the ultimate consequence of failure was hell. We have a sanitized, almost cartoonish idea of hell today. Theirs was not. It was vivid, physical, and eternal. They didn't just hear about it, they saw it. Church walls were covered in paintings of the damned. You would sit through a sermon and stare at a mural of demons tearing people limb from limb, boiling them in cauldrons, force-feeding them molten gold. The tortures were specific and gruesome, often designed to match the sin. The greedy were choked with money. The gossips had their tongues ripped out. This imagery wasn't meant to be symbolic. It was a literal depiction of what awaited you if you failed. Imagine living your whole life with those pictures burned into your mind. It was the ultimate horror story, and the church told you it was real. Every priest, every sermon, every stained glass window reinforced the message be good, or this is your fate. Not for a day, not for a year, but forever. The idea of eternal, conscious torment was the single greatest fear that shaped their world. The church, of course, was the only defense against this terror, and it wielded that power absolutely. The fear of God and the devil was channeled into a fear of the church's authority. The local priest held the keys to your salvation. He could hear your confession and grant you absolution, cleansing your soul. Or he could deny it. The ultimate weapon was excommunication. To be excommunicated was to be cut off from God. You couldn't receive the sacraments. You couldn't be buried in holy ground. Your soul was damned. But it was also a social death. Your neighbors, fearing for their own souls, would shun you. You became an outcast, a pariah. This gave the church immense power over every aspect of life, from politics and war, down to who you could marry and what you could eat on a Friday. So, this wasn't an abstract philosophical fear, it was a gut-level, everyday reality. It was the fear of a sudden storm, the fear of a sinful thought, the fear of a painting on a church wall. It was the fear of dying without a priest by your side. It was the knowledge that your every action was being watched and judged, and the stakes were not just your life, but your eternal, unending soul. It was the foundation of everything. For most people in the Middle Ages, life was a constant struggle against the physical world. We live in a world of central heating, supermarkets, and modern medicine. They did not. Their world was raw, unpredictable, and incredibly dangerous. The fear of nature wasn't about preserving the environment, it was about surviving it. The most constant, grinding fear was hunger. Famine was not a rare event, it was a regular visitor. Their entire existence depended on the harvest. They had no complex irrigation systems, no genetically modified crops, no global supply chain to fall back on. Everything depended on the local fields and the weather. A drought in the spring could mean starvation in the winter. Too much rain at harvest time could rot the grain in the fields. A crop disease could wipe out a village's entire food supply. When the harvest failed, the fear was slow and creeping. It started with rationing. Then came the hunger months of late winter and early spring, when the previous year's stores ran out and nothing new had yet grown. People would eat anything. They ate bark from trees, boiled leather, and weeds. They ate their seed grain, condemning themselves to another year of starvation. The chronicles are filled with horrific accounts of people driven to madness and cannibalism by hunger. It was a slow, agonizing death that loomed over every single growing season. Even in good years, most peasants lived right on the edge of subsistence. A single bad year could push them over. Then there was disease. They had no concept of germs or viruses. Sickness was a mystery. It could be a punishment from God, a curse from a witch, or the result of an imbalance of the humors in your body. A simple cut could lead to a fatal infection. A fever could be a death sentence. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for both mother and child, and then there were the great epidemics that swept through the population like wildfire. The Black Death is the most famous, and for good reason. It was an event of unimaginable terror. Imagine a third of your world dying in a few years. It wasn't a clean death. It was ugly, painful, and fast. People would go to bed healthy and be dead by morning. Black boils would appear on their bodies, they would develop a raging fever, and then they would die in agony. The social fabric completely fell apart. Priests, terrified for their own lives, refused to give last rites. And family members abandoned their sick. Carts rolled through the streets with the crier shouting, "Bring out your dead." The fear was not just of dying, but of dying alone, without spiritual comfort, your body dumped into a mass grave. The plague left a deep psychological scar on the survivors. The world seemed arbitrary, cruel, and meaningless. For God had either abandoned them, or was punishing them with a fury they couldn't comprehend. Beyond hunger and disease, there was the simple fear of the dark. We can't really imagine true darkness. Our cities glow all night. Even in the countryside, there's light from somewhere. Their world, after the sun went down, was pitch black. A village would have a few candles, a fire in the hearth, and that was it. The world outside that small circle of light was a place of immense fear. The forest at night was a place of pure terror. It was home to wolves and boars, which were a real threat to livestock and sometimes to people, especially lone travelers or children. But it was also home to imagined threats. They believed the woods were filled with spirits, fairies, demons, and outlaws. To be caught outside after dark was to risk both real and supernatural dangers. People huddled in their small, smoky homes, bolting the doors and praying for the sun to rise. The night was not a time of rest, it was a time of vulnerability, when the forces of chaos seemed to rule the world. Even the weather was a source of constant fear. A violent thunderstorm wasn't just a storm, it was a display of God's power and rage. They would ring church bells, believing the sacred sound could drive away the demons they thought rode the winds and threw the lightning bolts. A flood could wash away a village's fields and homes. A hailstorm could flatten a mature crop in minutes, destroying a year's work. Without weather forecasts or sturdy infrastructure, they were completely at the mercy of the elements. Their physical world was not a gentle, nurturing place. It was an active, often hostile force that had to be fought, appeased, and endured every single day. While people feared God and nature, perhaps the most immediate and unpredictable threat came from other people. Medieval society was incredibly violent. Life was cheap, and justice was brutal. The fear of your fellow man was a constant nagging reality. Warfare was endemic. It wasn't always the massive pitched battles we see in movies. More often, it was a kind of low-level, continuous violence. A local lord might decide to raid his neighbor's lands to steal cattle or burn crops. These small wars or feuds could drag on for generations, making the countryside a perilous place. For the average peasant, it didn't matter which lord won. When soldiers came through, your farm would be looted, your food stolen, your family threatened. Mercenary companies were another source of terror. During lulls in major wars, these bands of professional soldiers would be unemployed. They would then roam the land, living by extortion and robbery. They were a plague on the landscape, more feared than any official army because they had no rules and no master to answer to. A village in the path of a mercenary company could expect to be stripped bare. And if you lived in a town or castle, you feared the siege. Being trapped inside a walled city during a siege meant a slow descent into horror. First, you were cut off from the world. Then the food began to run out. Starvation set in with all its attendant miseries. Disease would run rampant in the crowded, unsanitary conditions, and you lived with the constant fear of the final assault. If the walls were breached, it often meant a massacre. The conquering army would be let loose to kill, rape, and plunder. But violence wasn't just for soldiers, it was woven into the fabric of everyday life. The justice system itself was a source of fear. Punishments were designed to be terrifying public spectacles. People were hanged, beheaded, burned at the stake, or subjected to mutilation like having a hand chopped off or their eyes put out. The purpose was to deter others through sheer horror. If you were accused of a crime, you might have to undergo a trial by ordeal. This meant holding a red-hot iron bar or being dunked in a river. If your hand healed cleanly or you sank and were hopefully pulled out in time, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty. It was a system based on superstition, not evidence, and it was terrifying for the accused. Even a simple disagreement could escalate into deadly violence. People carried knives. Brawls in taverns were common and could easily end in a fatal stabbing. Without a modern police force, personal honor was everything, and insults had to be answered, often with force. You had to be constantly wary of offending someone who was stronger or better connected than you. Your lord, the man who was supposed to protect you, could also be your greatest fear. A feudal lord had immense power over the peasants who worked his land. He could tax you into poverty. He could demand days of unpaid labor. He could conscript you to fight in his pointless wars. If he was cruel or greedy, there was very little you could do about it. The law was on his side. He was your judge, jury, and potential executioner, and the fear could be much closer to home than a distant lord or a marauding army. It could be your own neighbor. In a small, close-knit village, everyone knew everyone else's business. The gossip was a powerful and dangerous force. A personal grudge could fester for years before erupting into an accusation. The most feared accusation was witchcraft. If a cow suddenly went dry, or a child fell ill, or a storm ruined the crops, people looked for someone to blame. An unpopular old woman, a person who kept to themselves, could suddenly find themselves accused of being in league with the devil. Once the accusation was made, it was nearly impossible to defend yourself against. Suspicion, paranoia, and fear could turn a peaceful community against one of its own with terrifying speed. So you feared the soldier on the road, the lord in his castle, the judge in the court, and the neighbor in the next hut. Trust was a luxury. Your survival often depended on being quiet, being careful, and knowing who to fear the most. The medieval world was, for most people, very small. You might live and die within a 10-mile radius of where you were born. Your village was your universe. The next village over was a familiar place. The local market town was a big trip. Anything beyond that was, quite literally, the unknown. And they filled that unknown with monsters. Their maps tell the story. In the places they knew, Europe, North Africa, parts of the Middle East and Sahara, the maps were reasonably accurate. But as you moved to the edges, to the unexplored parts of Africa or Asia, things got strange. With mapmakers would draw bizarre creatures and monstrous races of men, men with their faces in their chests. Men with a single giant foot they used to shade themselves from the sun, men with the heads of dogs. They wrote, "Here be dragons," not just because it was a convenient way to fill empty space, but because they genuinely believed that monstrous things lived in these uncharted territories. They were not just fairy tales for children. Learned scholars and monks wrote about these creatures in their encyclopedias as if they were real. For the average person, the world beyond their small patch of land was not just empty, it was actively hostile and populated by horrors. The sea was another great unknown. For an inland farmer, it was a thing of legend. For a coastal fisherman or a sailor, it was a terrifying and unpredictable force. They had no good way to predict the weather. A calm sea could turn into a raging boat-splintering storm with little warning. But they feared more than just storms. They believed the ocean depths were teeming with monsters. Giant sea serpents that could crush a ship in their coils, krakens that could pull a vessel down to the abyss. These stories were born from misidentified whales or giant squids, but they took on a life of their own. To set sail was an act of incredible bravery, a journey into a realm of chaos where monsters and sudden death were real possibilities. Even the known world had its pockets of terrifying mystery. The forest was the most common one. The village and the fields were the realm of man, of civilization. The forest was something else. It was the boundary. During the day, it was a place you went for firewood or to hunt. But as dusk fell, it transformed. It was easy to get lost. There were no marked trails. Every tree looked the same. To be lost in the woods at night was a potential death sentence from exposure or animal attack. But the fear was deeper than that. The forest was the home of the supernatural. It was the realm of fairies, goblins, and ancient spirits, beings who were not necessarily evil like demons, but were capricious, dangerous, and utterly alien to humans. They might steal your baby and leave a changeling in its place. They might lure you off the path with strange lights and lead you to your doom. The forest was a place outside of God's order, a remnant of an older, wilder, pagan world. It was a place where the rules of civilization no longer applied. Outlaws and bandits also used the forest as their refuge, adding a real human danger to the supernatural fears. People also feared the future. In a world with so little control over disease, weather, or violence, they were desperate for any clue about what was to come. This led to a deep-seated fear of omens and portents. A comet streaking across the sky wasn't a beautiful astronomical event, it was a warning from God that a king would die or a great war was coming. An eclipse was a terrifying sign of divine anger. The birth of a deformed animal could be seen as a dark omen for the whole village. People looked for signs everywhere, in the flight of birds, in the patterns of stars, in their dreams. This constant search for meaning in random events created a world where everything was potentially a threat, a message of doom you had to decipher before it was too late. Their lack of scientific understanding left a huge void, and they filled that void with fear. Fear of the lands they had never seen, the creatures they had never met, and the future they could not control. Beyond the fear of a violent death or an eternity in hell, there was another, more subtle set of fears. These were the fears of social and spiritual ruin. It was the terror of becoming a nobody, of being erased from the community in this life and forgotten in the next. It was the fear of losing your place. In a small medieval village, your identity was your reputation. There were no official records for most people, no way to start over in a new town where nobody knew you. Who you were was defined by what your neighbors thought of you. Honor was not an abstract concept, it was the most valuable thing you owned. To lose it was to lose everything. Public shame was therefore a powerful tool and a profound fear. Punishments often involved public humiliation. A dishonest baker might be paraded through the streets with a bad loaf of bread tied around his neck. A gossiping woman might be forced to wear a heavy metal mask called a scold's bridle. Being put in the stocks in the village square was not just uncomfortable, it was a social disaster. People would mock you, throw garbage at you. The shame could stick to you and your family for years. This fear of public disgrace was a powerful force that kept people in line. You thought twice about cheating a customer or starting a rumor if the consequence was being made a spectacle of public scorn. The ultimate social punishment was to be cast out. If you committed a serious crime or became a complete outcast, you could be banished. This was a fate almost as bad as death. To be exiled from your home meant losing your entire world. You lost your family, your friends, your livelihood, your support system. You became a wanderer, a stranger everywhere you went. In a world deeply suspicious of outsiders, a lone traveler was a target for bandits and an object of distrust in every village they entered. How would you eat? Where would you sleep? Banishment was a sentence to a life of extreme vulnerability and loneliness. It was a kind of living death. The fear of poverty was also a constant. Most people were already poor, but there were levels of poverty. And a peasant with a small plot of land, even if he owed service to a lord, had a place. He had a home, he could feed his family most years. The great fear was losing that land. A bad harvest, a debt to the Lord, a long illness, any of these could cause you to lose your footing and slip into utter destitution. To become a landless beggar was to fall to the very bottom of society. Beggars were often seen as lazy or sinful. They were dependent on the charity of others, a deeply shameful position in a society that valued hard work and self-sufficiency. They were an uncomfortable reminder to everyone else of how easily one could fall from grace. And finally, there were the fears surrounding death itself. It wasn't just the fear of hell. It was the fear of a bad death. A good death was one that happened in your own bed, surrounded by family. You had time to confess your sins to a priest, to receive the last rites, and to make peace with God. A bad death was a sudden one. To be struck by lightning, to be murdered on the road, to fall from a horse and die alone. This meant dying without confession, with all your sins still on your soul. People believed that those who died a bad death could not rest. Their spirits might be trapped on earth as ghosts, haunting the place where they died. Or even worse, they could become a revenant, a physical corpse that rose from the grave to torment the living. Stories of these undead creatures were common. A revenant might bring disease to a village or attack its former neighbors. To prevent this, the bodies of those who died suddenly or who were suspected of evil, were often mutilated before burial, decapitated, or staked to the ground to ensure they stayed in their graves. For the average decent person who wasn't wicked enough for hell but wasn't a saint, there was the fear of purgatory. This was a relatively new idea in the Middle Ages, but it took hold with immense power. Purgatory was a place of temporary punishment where souls were purified by fire before they could enter heaven. It was like a temporary hell. Your time there could last for hundreds or even thousands of years. This fear was deeply personal. It was the fate most people expected, and it drove a whole economy of fear. People paid the church to say masses for their dead relatives, believing these prayers could shorten their time in the cleansing fires. They bought indulgences which were supposed to reduce their own future sentence. The fear of purgatory was the fear of a long, painful wait for salvation, a fear that shaped how people gave to the church, how they remembered their dead, and how they contemplated their own imperfect lives. It was the final fear in a life full of them, the fear of not quite making it.